You come out of the opening just fine in the Giuoco Piano. You get to the middle game and you freeze. You don't know where to put your pieces, you don't know what the plan is, and when your opponent plays something you weren't expecting, that's when the whole game falls apart. In this video, I'm going to put an end to that once and for all. You're going to learn one single plan for the Giuoco Piano, where each piece goes, the maneuvers that build up your attack almost on autopilot, and the plan keeps working even when your opponent plays something weird. And there's more. I'm also going to show you how to punish the guys who try to get cute and attack while breaking opening principles, because most of the time they just hand you a piece for free, and you've got to be ready to take the gift. So yeah, no messing around. I'm Philip. Let's jump right in. E4, E5. Knight to f3, threatening the e5 pawn. Knight to c6 comes in, defending, and bishop to c4. From here, your opponent has three possible responses: knight to f6, h6, and bishop to c5. I'm going to cover each one of them, and you'll notice the middle game plans and the attacking ideas are really similar, plus some tricks to punish your opponent. So let's start with bishop to c5. And after this move, you've also got some interesting options ahead of you. You can go with castling, with c3, or with d3. And the move order here doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, you're going to end up in basically the same position. Even if your opponent picks different moves, the plans stay the same. So you don't need to memorize anything. The important thing is to understand the idea, know where to put your pieces, and where each one of them needs to go. That way, when your opponent plays something different, you're going to spot it right away and think, wait, that move looks off. That's not how you play this position. But we're going to break all of that down throughout the video. For now, we castle. After knight to f6, attacking the pawn, you push the pawn to d3. And this is where the first question usually comes up. Why not just bring the knight to c3 right away? The reason is simple. You want to keep the knight free to go to d2 later on without locking it up on c3. And that way, you can also deal way more easily with a bishop to g4 pin, which is going to show up in the vast majority of your games, without needing to weaken your king side by playing h3. But we're also going to look at how to exploit the position by playing h3, which in some positions is actually the best move. So instead of developing the knight right away, you defend the e4 pawn with another pawn, keeping the path open to bring the knight to d2 down the line, which is exactly the main plan for developing the knight in the Giuoco Piano. Next up, your opponent plays d6, and this move comes with a threat to take your bishop pair. For example, if you play knight to d2, black goes knight to a5, and your bishop just has nowhere to go. Because of that, the most common move here ends up being c3, because now if your opponent tries to go after the bishop pair, you've got bishop to b5 check. If they come back with c6, you follow up with bishop to a4. And if your opponent decides to keep pushing with b5, now you've got the c2 square for your bishop, a defensive maneuver ready to go. And the best part is, on top of solving the problem, you also leave their knight in a really bad spot, and you're already threatening the fork on the very next move. And this happens all the time, because a lot of times your opponent just castles without thinking and ends up losing a piece. And from that point on, you're basically winning. That's exactly why c3 is so useful, because it creates that escape route for the bishop. Now that you know you're not going to lose the bishop pair after pawn to c3, black's plan here is to keep developing, whether that's castling or bringing the bishop out. Since the move order doesn't really matter here, let's go with castling first. And while we're at it, let me show you one of the plans you already have here with white, which is playing a4. But what's the idea behind a4? Basically, to gain space on the queen side. If your opponent plays carelessly here, developing the bishop to g4, you end up winning a piece after that sequence. Now, the most common response in this position is pawn to a6 or a5. Let's follow the most common line here and go with a6, which creates the escape square for the bishop. Now you develop your rook to e1, defending your e4 pawn once again. This move is important because it's going to allow you to play d4 later on without losing the e4 pawn, since before the rook got to e1, the pawn was its only defender. In other words, rook to e1 is all about setting up d4 down the line. The most common move here is bishop to g4, and now you play knight to d2. And you might be thinking, wait, wouldn't it be better to just develop that bishop instead of leaving it stuck here doing nothing? Here's the thing. In the Giuoco Piano, white's dark squared bishop doesn't need to leave its starting square, because it already puts good pressure from c1 as it is. It might not look like it right now, but later on, you're going to see how this piece can be extremely annoying from that. And I'm going to show you that further down the line. And coming up next, your plan is going to be getting the knight to g3. At this point, black usually plays queen to d7 to connect the rooks, and your goal becomes pulling off the knight maneuver from f1 and then bringing the knight over to g3. So what's the idea behind this maneuver? Let's say your opponent realizes the action is going to happen on the king side and starts moving pieces over there, playing knight to e7. You follow up with knight to g3, and this is where the plan comes together. When you play h3 to kick the bishop, your opponent won't have the h5 square available to retreat and keep the bishop pair anymore, which is a pretty significant long-term loss from a strategic standpoint. In other words, they're forced to choose between taking your knight or retreating to the e6 square. And that's one of the ways to deal with this pin in the Giuoco Piano. I already have a video here on the channel showing how to punish this kind of pin that shows up in a lot of openings for both white and black and can be really annoying, so I'm going to leave it on the end screen for you to check out later. So after knight to f1, already knowing about the knight maneuver to g3, black usually brings the bishop back. And here you don't want to take, because if you take that bishop, you're actually helping your opponent build an attack against your king. Notice that by taking, you'd open up their rook, and that rook, together with the bishop on c5, would become really annoying to deal with, targeting your f2 pawn. So you're not going to want to take here. Usually what you do is bring the bishop back to b3, and your opponent wouldn't really have any interest in taking it either. But let's say they go ahead and take anyway. In that case, you recapture, and now you're threatening to grab the b7 pawn. But that's a threat you're not going to want to follow through on right away, specifically because you don't want to hang your queen. But what do I mean by hanging the queen? Imagine your opponent plays h6, and you, thinking you've got a free pawn, go queen takes b7. The problem is they respond with knight to a5, trapping your queen. That's why you've got to be really careful with those b2 and b7 pawns that look like they're just hanging there, because most of the time they're poisoned pawns, meaning they exist specifically to lure your queen into a trap. So, after queen takes bishop on b3, what's your plan? And the answer comes down to a really powerful positional idea, fighting for control of the f5 square. For example, the strongest move and the most played in the database is h6, and from there, you follow up with knight to g3 with the idea of planning it on f5. Once it's on f5, the knight works as an outpost, a piece that puts pressure on multiple points around the king that your opponent just can't ignore. Because every time they try to solve the problem, they end up creating a new weakness. For example, if your opponent plays knight to e7, trying to control the knight jump to f5, you can double down on the idea and play knight to h4. Now when you put a knight on f5, if they take it, you just bring the other one in. And with that, you've got the complete plan for how to build an attack when your opponent accepts the light squared bishop trade. Now, what changes when your opponent decides not to trade that bishop? The most common continuation for black is knight to e7, and the logic behind this maneuver is twofold, moving the knight away from possible tactics while also placing it on a square with more activity in the game. And you might be wondering, what tactics am I talking about? In some positions, you can pull the bishop back to c2, and now if your opponent isn't careful, there's a fork theme with d4, because after the trades, you're still attacking the bishop, and if they move the bishop, you've got the d5 push winning a piece. That's exactly why knight to e7 is a really strong move from your opponent, and you follow up with knight to g3, which is part of your plan. The most common move from your opponent here is knight to g6, and at this point, I recommend going with bishop to c2. And now, a really common question that people ask me comes up, which is, what if after you bring the bishop to c2, your opponent plays knight to f4? How do you deal with that idea? It might look like a move that messes up our plan, since we don't have any pawn to kick the knight, and most of the time, we don't really want to trade a bishop for a knight either. But in this specific position, you can actually take the knight with the bishop, and then follow up with knight to e2, attacking the pawn. And if your opponent responds with knight to h5, instead of playing queen to d2 to pile on another attack, I recommend going knight to g5, chasing down the light squared bishop, because in certain scenarios, that's exactly the piece that causes the most problems against your king side, right? Alright, now let's see what happens if instead of castling, you play c3 first. This time black responds with knight to f6, developing the piece and already attacking e4. And this is where you want to go for the modest d3. Sometimes your opponent's going to be fooled by how passive this move looks. They're going to think your game is soft and they'll want to attack the center with d5. But in reality, this ends up being a big mistake. After the trade on d5, you follow up with queen to b3, a move your opponent completely overlooked. Now you're attacking the knight on d5, and it has nowhere to go, because if it moves, you take the pawn on f7 with check, and that's just fail. So they're stuck in a really uncomfortable spot where they need to do something with that knight, but it's really not clear what. In this position, the best move, believe it or not, is for your opponent to bring the knight back to f6, and then when you take the pawn on f7 with check, the best move is for your opponent to play king to f8. These are really counterintuitive moves for your opponent because they lose a pawn and also lose the right to castle. And that's exactly why most of the time they're going to try knight to a5, looking for a counterattack. But that loses to queen to b5 check, hitting both the bishop and the knight at the same time. So on the next move, you take one of the minor pieces and come out with a material advantage. Let's go back a little. What else could black try here? If we play bishop to e6, trying to defend the knight in the most natural way, they end up leaving the b7 pawn hanging, since there's no longer a bishop on c8. So you can go ahead and take that pawn, and on top of that, attack the knight on c6. And once again, it's really awkward for black to defend, because they can't just move the queen away. The queen needs to keep protecting the rook, and if it moves, you take the rook in the corner. And what happens if they move the knight? If they play knight to e7 or knight to a5, the same tactic works. You retreat with queen to b5, setting up a double attack, take the pawn on b7, win the bishop, and come out with a material advantage. Now, another option for your opponent is, instead of developing the knight to f6, they go pawn to h6, because they're scared of the knight landing on g5, attacking the weakness on f7, like in the Freiliver attack. Truth is, h6 wastes a tempo. But it lets us see a really interesting plan for white that a lot of people underestimate. We know that c3 is setting up the d4 push, and of course in a lot of lines you're actually going to play that advance. But on top of that, there's another idea your opponent's probably going to miss, because that same pawn on c3 also lets you expand on the queen side with b4. And once again, the strongest move here is a little counterintuitive. We're talking about bishop to d6, which at first glance looks bad since it blocks the d7 pawn from advancing and makes it harder to develop the bishop on c8. But the bishop on d6 plays a really important role. It defends the central pawn on e5. That way, when we push the b5, taking the knight, the e5 pawn is already protected. But if instead your opponent goes with the most common move, which is bishop to b6, you play b5, kicking the knight, and you can win the pawn. Now you might be thinking, can't they just go knight to a5 attacking the bishop? Sure they can, but then we've got a really beautiful sequence. You play bishop takes f7, and if they take back, you follow up with knight to e5 check. Just like that, you're winning in just a few moves. With this queenside expansion your opponent wasn't expecting. And what do they do now? If the king goes to f8 or e7, either one of those squares, you follow up with knight to g6, which is a fork on the king and the rook, since you've already taken the pawn on e5. On the next move, you grab the rook on h8 and keep attacking the king. So white wins easily. Now, let's go back, because if the king goes to e8, queen to h5 check leads to scholar's mate, and if the king moves anywhere else, you can keep attacking in a bunch of different ways. It's an easy win for white. For example, bishop to a3, which is another way for white to give check, and after d6, you finish with queen to f7, something really close to scholar's mate. So we saw that h6 is a terrible idea, and the best move is actually knight to f6. Then comes d3, which is also the best move, and up to this point, everything is still theory. Now, when your opponent plays d3, they're coming in with a really clear plan, and I'm going to explain that in just a bit. At this point, you could go with a3 to give the bishop an escape square, already anticipating ideas like knight to a5, but I'm going to recommend playing bishop to b3. It's a useful and flexible move, because with the bishop on b3, you can drop back to c2 to support the e4 pawn and then push d4 at the right moment. The most common move for black here is to castle and then play bishop to g4, pinning the knight. But usually, for some reason, your opponent waits for you to castle first before they pin the knight. So a lot of the time, they're going to castle expecting you to castle too, and that's totally fine. Now I'm going to show you a solid plan to deal with your opponent's idea. Bishop to g4 comes in, pinning the knight, and you respond with h3, kicking that bishop. The bishop then drops back to keep the pin. And from here, you follow the plan of rerouting the knight to d2 with the idea of going through f1 and landing on g3. Notice that the plan and the ideal squares for your pieces are still the same, and that really helps you understand the typical plan in the Giuoco Piano, even if your opponent plays moves that are a little different from what you'd expect. And in this position, if they try d5, guess what? That doesn't change a thing. You don't take there, you just ignore it and keep going with your own plan. You move the rook to e1, freeing up the square for the knight, and that rook on e1 also supports your pawns in the center. So if there's a pawn trade in the center, again, that doesn't change your plan. At this point, I've got two important things to talk about. The first one is that before you move the knight to f1, it's important to get the queen off the file because you want to attack and you don't want to trade queens. The second important thing is that if your opponent notices your idea of rerouting the knight to f1 and then g3, they can play h6 so that when the knight gets to g3, they can tuck the bishop away on h7. And when they do that, you go queen to e2, getting your queen out of the x-ray. The most common move is queen to e7, finishing development and connecting the rooks, and then you follow through with the plan of bringing the knight to f1. Here, the best move for your opponent is knight to a5, going after the bishop, because that bishop is really strong on that diagonal. But that move isn't even in the top 7 most played moves in this position. Instead, they go with rook to d8, because they realize you're shifting your pieces over to the king side, and they can try to double up on the file or even swing the rook to d6 to defend the 6th rank. You then go knight to g3, attacking the bishop, and from here the knight can jump to f5, hitting the queen and also putting pressure on the d6 square. And if, for example, the bishop goes back to g6, you follow up with the other knight to h4, attacking the bishop once again. And if they don't do anything, you win the bishop because the pawn is penned. So the bishop is forced to go to h7, and then you plant the knight on f5. Finally getting this beautiful monster of a knight on f5, and it's still hitting their queen on e7. They can try to trade that knight off, but that's no problem, because you've got the other knight backing it up, so the knight takes back, and on top of that, keeps attacking the queen. After the queen moves, in this kind of position, with the knight already sitting on f5, plus that active bishop, and the bishop on c1 ready to get into the game, you can see there are a lot of tactical ideas to explore here. Another way to go is to bring the queen closer, because you can actually mate your opponent's king with it. So you can play queen to f3, and from there start putting on the pressure, even going queen to g3, threatening queen takes g7 checkmate. Bringing the queen in really strengthens the attack, and if your opponent plays something like knight to e7 trying to trade off your knight, you still have plenty of ways to keep attacking. One really strong move is to go knight takes h6, and after your opponent takes back, there's an even stronger move than taking the knight on f6. For example, if you take the knight right away, they respond with queen to d6, pretty much forcing a queen trade. Instead, I recommend you go ahead and take the pawn on h6 with the bishop, and now your opponent has two pieces under attack, the rook on f8 and the knight on f6. If they decide to save the rook, you take the knight and threatening mate on g7, and then they're going to have to give up a ton of material just to avoid the checkmate. That's why a lot of players end up going with knight to h7, defending the rook, but that doesn't solve anything because you follow up with queen to g3 check. And here it gets even worse since they're going to have to give up the queen on g4. Then you might be wondering, what about knight to g6? Well, that's actually mate in 2 because the bishop is pinning the king. In this example, you can see how a mid-game plan, knowing what to do and where to put your pieces in a really clear way, punishes your opponent even when they follow the opening principles correctly. Now, this is where you really need to pay attention because we're going to look at what to do when your opponent goes for more aggressive moves and doesn't give you time to get your pieces out. Let's take a look at a position similar to the one we just saw, but this time we're going to go through a continuation with some deeper ideas. Now, unlike the other position where we castled and at some point the opponent pushed d5 in the center, it's a different story here because there are going to be games where your opponent plays more aggressive moves, and when you're under that kind of pressure, it can leave you in a really uncomfortable spot, and that's when you're way more likely to slip up. So the first thing to do here, just like in the previous position, is play bishop to b3, keeping the bishop aimed at f7 and preparing an escape square in case your opponent plays knight to h5. From there, your opponent might try bishop to g4, pinning the knight. And what I recommend here is playing h3 to kick that bishop. usually they end up retreating the bishop back to h5, keeping that pin. And here I'm going to recommend you stick with the plan and play knight to d2. Now, you might be wondering, wouldn't the right move to be to castle and get the king out of the center? Yeah, you're right. But since the center's locked up and we've got this pawn chain, there's no immediate way for your opponent to exploit the king in the center. So you can delay castling for a move or two, develop a piece to a more active square, and set up an attack before your opponent gets a chance to regroup. Now, that doesn't mean you should just go around leaving your king in the center in every game. Principles exist to give you a clear direction when you don't know what to do. And in the vast majority of positions, castling is still the right move. But chess goes beyond just following rules. Because when you look at the position and start to see that it gives you a more active option than what the basic principle suggests, and that going for that initiative brings you a much bigger edge than just following natural development, that's when you're starting to think like a serious player. Because principles are a starting point, but you always got to evaluate the position with a cool head. And here the idea is pretty clear. Maneuver the knight to f1 and then to g3, which is exactly the same plan we've been looking at throughout the video. As for your opponent, the most natural move here is to castle, just a normal developing move. So we follow up with knight to f1, and then comes h6, preventing you from pitting the knight. If your opponent drops the bishop back to g6, you continue with knight to g3 and castle, and we end up in a position really similar to the previous example. But coming back to our line here, after h6, I'm going to recommend the strongest move in the position, which is g4. And when the bishop retreats, you keep pushing your attack with g5, hitting the knight and the h6 pawn, which basically forces your opponent to take. And then right after the trade, you simply pin the knight. So if your opponent tries to get out of the pin with queen to e2, for example, you bring more pieces into the attack by playing knight to g3. And if they go knight to h5, I'm going to recommend following up with a knight to h4 here, threatening the bishop, because our bishop on b3 is pinning the defending pawn. On top of that, the knight on h5 is now attacked twice, and usually they're going to end up taking your knight on g3 to try and relieve some of the pressure. But here, you can simply ignore the fact that your rook is hanging and go knight takes on g6. And if your opponent gets greedy and takes your rook, you keep your attack going with queen to h5, and there's no stopping checkmate. And that's exactly the kind of plan that makes the difference in the Giuoco Piano middle game. But now, let me ask you something. How many times have you tried to execute these Giuoco Piano plans and your opponent went bishop to g4 early in the opening, pinning your knight? This is the most common move against anyone who plays the Italian, and most players just accept the pin and keep developing like nothing happened. The problem is that bishop is taking away your knight's mobility, messing up your development, and when you get to the middle game, all those plans you just learned become way harder to pull off because you're already coming out of the opening in a worse position. So click on the video that's popping up on your screen right now where I'm going to show you the Capablanca method to punish this bishop pin in 5 different ways, whether you're playing white or black. It's the kind of knowledge that makes sure you get to the middle game with a solid position to pull off everything you learned here. Click now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.